Okay, bit clickbaity, don't start shouting at me. Now I know Firouzja and Bobby Fischer are not yet in the same league. Alireza's just 19, he's got his whole career stretched before him. But it feels to me like when Alireza goes 1e4, he's really that 2800 player that just stormed the world. When he goes 1d4, c4, well maybe then he's more in this kind of 2750 plus club, 2770s or so, something like that. So he played e4 all through this Crypto Cup, finished third just behind Magnus and Prague, who had this phenomenal run. Magnus is Magnus, so he did very, very well here. So I want to look at one of Firouzja's e4 games today, and do let me know your thoughts on this. If you think there's any other phenomenal e4 players down your time who you love to watch, do let me know in the comments. Let's have a look at this game here. So Alireza kicks off with, yes, 1e4. Now we had e5 from Levon, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Spanish game or the Roy Lopez gets called both. And now we had knight f6 from Levon, the rock solid Berlin defense. Vladimir Kramnik really popularized this one back in 2000, I think it was, playing in the World Championship match against Garry Kasparov. Kasparov just could not break through, and he was the world's greatest attacker of the time. So knight f6 played. Now, if you castle here, this is the famous Berlin endgame. It goes on from here, the queens come off, that kind of thing. But if you don't castle, if instead you go d3, this is what Alireza played, well now the position takes on a very different character. Bishop c5 is the standard move. It's much more of a normal kind of Roy Lopez position, similar structures to the main lines with a6, etc. So now c3 from Alireza, prepares d4 later, possibly even b4 at the right moment. Now castle's played by both players, rook to e8, standard stuff. And now you can go knight b to d2 here, very common looking move. You can expand with b4 even, set up the old bathtub here if you've never heard of that pawn formation. But Alireza goes for bishop to g5 instead. So he's brought both bishops out, very aggressive, pinning these knights. And now a6 puts a question to one of those bishops, and I find this moment really interesting. So the most common move here, as you can imagine, is bishop to a4. This is so often a prized piece in these structures, tucking back here or even here to later then support d4 and everything. But here Alireza doesn't tuck it back. He gives up bishop for knight, shatters the pawn structure, and then just plays pawn to h3. And when I was analysing this game, I was trying to think, why would he give up his bishops? Why would he shatter the structure? What's the compensation? And it strikes me that now that you've moved this d pawn to c6, well, it can no longer come to d6 and support e5. You can never break with d5 in the centre here, and it's slightly easier to achieve d4 now because the knight on c6 doesn't control these two squares. So this seems to be what Alireza's playing for in compensation for giving up his bishops. And now the bishop tucks back to f8 here. Looks kind of strange. The top engine moves are bishop f8, bishop e7, bishop a7. Basically, they want to get this bishop out the way because it's running into d4 in a lot of lines. And say you go queen d6 immediately, which we see in the game, you can even go d4 straight away because if captures, then there's e5. And if rook takes, this is the trick. Bishop f4, you're winning a whole rook. Basically, this is just +5 for white, so not good. So the queen doesn't come to d6 yet. The bishop tucks back. Now we had queen e2 from Alireza. The engine prefers rook e1 there out of interest. It doesn't like lining up the rook with the queen, and we do see this one transfer to c2 later on. But okay, not a bad move. Queen d6 now played. Knight b to d2. This one's heading for c4, pressuring e5. So Levon tucks back with this knight, very thematic, defends the pawn, prepares f6 in some lines, and sometimes you're coming to c5 to pressure down here and on e4. So bishop h4 from Alireza. He's tucking round like this, again wants to put pressure on this pawn. a5 from Lev, good move, gains some queenside space. He has to come up with a plan of his own. Bishop g3 hits the pawn. Pawn b6 from Levon, very tidy. And now bishop c4, knight c4 was played. And also this b6 move, by the way, you know, if you go d4 too hastily, well then bishop a6 can come, bit uncomfortable. So that's the other thing that b6 opens up. So knight c4 played, the queen transfers to f6, and now Alireza tucks back with this knight. f4 is very much on the cards, so b5 was played, gaining yet more space. The knight hopped into e3, and now queen d8, a prophylactic move, anticipating f4. You know, you don't want the queen on that f-file. So black is a bit passive, but solid enough right now, only a small advantage to white. So Alireza goes rook a to d1. He doesn't hurry with f4, puts the rook opposite that queen. Now we had a4 from Levon, and now you can go f4 here. You know, if you're going to play it, this is really the moment. You could have a line like this, say knight c5 hitting this pawn. Something like knight f3 could come. You can't push d4 too soon or you lose on e4. This is the thing, white has to be careful. You can't just steamroll black immediately in these positions. But okay, Alireza didn't go f4. You know, it makes me wonder if the great Bobby would have gone f4 there. He always used to play in a very direct manner, I felt, when I watched his games. So a3 was played instead. Just stops that one. Although it does weaken this square, we note. And now knight c5 was played. Already looks at this square and this pawn. And this is why Alireza now has to go knight to f3 to open up the defense of this pawn using the rook. But now he's blocked his f-pawn, of course, so room for a slightly slower battle here, no immediate pawn break. So f6 now from Levon. He defends that e5 pawn. Alireza comes to c2, so he comes off the e line, adds some defense here, but now bishop e6 was played, looks down here, trying to use this skewer. It looks so natural to actually do this, but just running back one move here, actually something like queen e7 was best, for the simple reason that you prevent d4, because now we take, say pawn recaptures, will you lose a pawn here? This is the whole thing, it prevents d4. But when you go bishop e6, although it looks nice, Alireza finds this brilliant move. It doesn't stop d4, he plays d4 anyway. This is the beautiful thing. And actually when you're running this with the engine, its top line here is to take, and then plant this bishop here, carry on with your plan. Then white could take here. If black takes the queen, this is the top line. We take here, rook recaptures. We chop the bishop on c2, and okay, black to move. You can defend this pawn with rook d7 from the bishop. You could take this one. You could possibly even take this one, or it doesn't love it. You know, lots going on, but Levon rejected this. I can see why. These pawns are looking a bit fragile. You know, if this one drops on c6, then b5 is weak. And usually the two minors are going to outplay the rook in such a position as this. So Levon just chickened out of this whole variation. I mean, maybe chickened is the wrong word, but he didn't go for it. Instead, after d4, he retreats this knight, but it's a bit meek, because now Alireza, he can already actually win on e5 and allow this bishop b3 stuff. Pretty tactical, but you're using this open D line, knight coming to e5, all of that stuff. So even though you give an exchange, you're kind of gaining the material back. But Alireza plays a bit more human here. He goes pawn to c4, he shuts out that bishop b3 idea, and now we had queen to e7 from Levon, so he comes off that d file opposite the rook. Alireza takes on e5, and this is Lev's big problem. He's just losing a pawn now. So the pawn recaptured, and now we see Alireza take with the bishop, which looks kind of strange. You might think, well, why didn't he go with the knight? And you can kind of do either. But the reason he's gone with this one is that if Levon took this piece, which didn't happen, well, now when you recapture with the knight, if you go for this tactic of bishop takes on h3, opening the queen, well, then there's the counter shot of knight takes on c6, hitting that queen. And it's quite nice that if queen g5, then you've still got this knight actually protecting the checkmate here. So, you know, you could just pick up another pawn. White's absolutely dominating. So coming back here, after this, where are we? So bishop takes on e5. Yeah, we didn't have knight takes on e5. Instead, Levon immediately goes for this shot of bishop takes on h3. And he would maybe have sensed that it doesn't fully work, but when you're a clean pawn down, you have to try and mix things up and complicate, or you'll just get crushed positionally. So Alireza now ignores that bishop. if you take this one, knight takes here, suddenly black is right back in the game, because for the sake of a pawn, you've got tons of pressure here, and importantly, an exposed king to compensate that pawn. So Alireza doesn't take the bishop, he chops on c7, excellent move. This black bishop now has to retreat, and then he comes into d6. This is the thing, when you eliminate this pawn, you now gain access to this critical square. So the queen comes to f6, we now have e5 with tempo, and by the way, back here, if it had come to f7, well, now you're running into knight g5, so there wasn't really such a great square. So e5 played, the queen came to h6, now knight d4, and this is the big challenge. Black is just getting steamrolled in the center, the white pieces are springing to life, so you're hitting the bishop, you're also hitting this unprotected pawn, and so Levon comes up with this way to defend the pawn. He captures on d6, pawn recaptures, and now he can sink a knight on e5, defend this pawn. Now you're probably thinking, well, what happens if you go f4 immediately to kick the defender? And you can do this. Knight takes here would be the main line, knight recaptures, bishop recaptures, and you can now go knight f5 in between moves before you move the rook. You hit the queen, queen goes, rook moves. This is still better for white, you know, big pass pawn, horrible knight for black to deal with on f5. So f4 immediately was possible, but Alireza finds the most accurate way of playing. So he first takes on b5. So at the minute you can't sink a black piece on that square anymore. The pawn recaptures. Now he chops on e6, very simple. Gets rid of that light squared bishop. He doesn't have one. That could be a real counterplay danger. Let's eliminate it. Rook recaptures. Now he goes f4. The knight moves away to f7 here, so looking to recoup this pawn. This was the nice thing about this whole variation. It couldn't come to c4 anymore. We just chop, win a pawn. Now knight f5 from Alireza. So again, he picks up a tempo on this unfortunate queen. It moves away, and now he goes knight e7 check. King moves to h8, and now knight d5. So look at the dance that this knight has been on, into here, into here, into here. Queen moves again, queen f5, and now this knight still isn't done. So you hit two pieces here, and to give you a sense of how dire this position is, already the computer just wants to take on d6, give up a whole knight. But here we had rook e2 from Levon, much more natural, looking for counterplay around the king, looking to checkmate. But knight c3 from Alireza, great move, gets rid of the rook. By the way, if you take the knight, then queen g3 is annoying. This is the problem. Threatening mate, you can only actually stop with the knight. Then we take like this, check, king h2. Actually, white's still a little bit better, but okay, why go in for any of this? So instead, knight c3, kicks the rook, and now this is where you have to be so careful. You know, players like myself, other amateur players, you're in time trouble. There's absolutely no doubt here, I'm sure. I would have just chopped this knight on f7. And then can you see the phenomenal resource which black has in this position to now create a draw here from here? Here from here, what a great sentence. So here you can play rook to h3. So you're threatening mate using this geometry of the queen. So taking the rook is forced, and then we check like this. King goes, and bang, you're into perpetual. Just a phenomenal resource, really nice. But both players saw this. You know, this is the difference, the level these guys are at. So Alireza leaves the queen, covering h3. He instead plays pawn to d7, leaves the knight alone, and now black is just absolutely scrambling. So king g8 was now played, covers the knight. In some lines, it covers the kind of back rank checkmate stuff. We had knight takes on b5 from Alireza. So there's now a threat to go knight c7, then into e6 and all this kind of stuff. So the rook comes to d8, knight d4 played, again heading for e6. We had knight h6, desperate stuff now from Levon, kicking this queen. But here we had a very simple move to finish the game, queen g5. Double attack on these pieces, so queen trade is forced, pawn recaptures, the knight has to go. I mean, if it comes to f7, then knight c6 is just curtains. So top engine line here is takes on d7, just giving an entire piece. Absolutely over, as you can see. So Alireza Firouzja, what a phenomenal e4 player. I hope you enjoyed this game. If you do want to see more like this, then consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to see another amazing Ali Firouzja versus Levon Aronian game, click here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.